He felt the wood grain of the balcony rail under his palm, felt the hum of the event below, and a rare thing hardened in him, attention. Stay with your mother, he said softly, folding the paper and tucking it into his jacket. And don't tell anyone else yet. Lena nodded with a relief that made the tremor stop. Rosa's jaw loosened, but the woman's eyes were not foolish with gratitude. They were calculating, scanning for what might come next. Sir, she said. I don't know why she heard. Maybe it was nothing. You did the right thing, Michael told them. He could not have known then how small a thread he'd grasped, yet that tiny gesture would pull a whole tangle loose. The quartet played on. A server brushed past, carrying a tray of champagne. The word trap, which had seemed to arrive in a child's hand like a joke, now sat in the pocket of his suit like a live coal. He descended the staircase with the note in his head and a quiet knot of worry in his chest. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt the thinning of the line between the world he paid to hold together and the unpredictable human pieces that refused to be contained. In the small security room that smelled of coffee and electronics, Michael watched grainy footage spool across 3 monitors. Gavin, his head of personal security, stood with arms folded, beard shadowing his face like a permanent frown. Gavin's world was numbers, door codes, and patterns. The kid built a reputation on never being surprised. Tonight, he looked as if he could be. "Lou, you sure about this?" he asked. Kid, Mr. Thompson? Could be misinterpretation." Michael did not answer immediately. The CCTV showed the alley behind the Marlowe and one of the delivery doors. It showed a gray van, a courier with a posture like a man carrying something too heavy for his back. And, if you focused on a particular 2 minutes and squinted, the way 2 figures paused as they lifted a crate. There was a shadow at the crate's base that looked like a coil of hose. It wasn't clear. The footage was everything and nothing. "But I want every access point swept," Michael said. All vendors checked, every truck inspected. Gavin's fingers moved across a tablet. I'll call the check. "But if you make something out of nothing tonight, a lot of people will look at you strange." "I know how people will look at me," Michael replied. Do it." He knew the risk of seeming paranoid. He had been in positions where the appearance of anxiety could be a liability. Donors might cancel. Journalists might sniff a story. But the note had changed something in him that money couldn't buy. Accountability to a small, clear voice. He kept thinking about Lena's face, the way she had watched him, as if placing the burden on him had been the bravest thing she'd ever done. Back with Rosa, Lena clung to a small, battered stuffed rabbit. They had been escorted to a quiet service corridor by a young event manager named Claire, who wore an expression that held professional concern. Did you hear words? Did anyone threaten you?" Claire asked. Lena nodded, then paused as if deciding how much a child should carry of the adult world. "They say when the lights go down, the confetti will fall, and then people will be sick." "Lots of people." "Mama, they said vent and start and a name." "Someone said Mr. Thompson." Rosa's hand tightened around Lena's shoulders. Her voice came low and steady. "You saw people load the boxes?" "Oh, yes," Lena said. They had uniforms like the other truckmen, but their faces looked mean. One was tall. He had a scar on his cheek. A small detail, but in a city of millions, a scar is a fact that narrows a search. Gavin asked for every delivery manifest, cross-checked license plates, and pulled background checks. He sent 2 trusted agents to the alley to inspect the crates. Michael stood at the doorway of the security room while the machines did their silent work. "If nothing's there, we call it a false alarm?" "If nothing's there, we still run a more thorough check," Gavin answered. "We don't gamble, Mr. Thompson. They found the first anomaly in a crate labeled as stage props, confetti that had been stored in a back room near the HEV access. The crate's packing was standard cardboard, but the interior had been lined with a modified cylinder and a pressure nozzle. It was crude, not lethal engineering the way a professional bomb maker would craft, but dangerous in a different way, a dispersal device meant to circulate a chemical irritant when triggered by a pressure drop or timed cue. Gavin's jaw tightened. This could do a lot of damage in a crowded room. "Rario, who loaded it?" Michael asked, voice flat. The manifest showed a local vendor. The vendor's driver was listed, his van license checked. But when Gavin's team ran the plates, a different name emerged. one that did not match the vendor's records and had been used in a string of minor frauds. The tall man with the scar was a name they recognized from an old security file, hired hand in a failed extortion scheme against a nonprofit 3 years earlier. He had vanished from the grid for a while and reappeared in the edges of night work, sets, strikes, cheap run jobs. Across the monitors, Michael watched the image of crates and connectors. Lena's note had been a single line of warning. The footage and the crate were the slow, methodical verification of it. The truth had a patience of its own. A child hears, a man with power investigates, and procedures either catch up or fail. Tonight, the procedures mattered. Don't publicize this," Gavin said quietly, reading the room as well as he did security logs. We handle this quietly. You leave now, let us sweep the rest." No," Michael said. "We don't leave. We stay close. We control how this unfolds." Gavin opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded. "All right, we make a plan." There was an uneasy truce between doubt and action. Lena had given them a single, raw fact. Their job now was to stitch that fact into a coherent picture and prevent a night of celebration from becoming a night of tragedy. Rose's hands were on Lena's shoulders when they walked past the monitors. Lena did not look at the crate. She had done the dangerous thing already. She watched Michael instead, like someone who had handed an adult a key and was waiting to see which door would unlock. Michael had built his life around public gestures, grand signings, plaques, speeches. Tonight, however, the theater of his own safety required him to be small, cunning, and invisible in ways money couldn't buy. He and Gavin opted for a soft deception. Proceed with the evening, but change the cues only they knew about. If the perpetrators expected a single-timed sequence, changing scripts and shuttering one entrance might confuse them. If the conspirators were watching for him to step onto a particular carpet or respond to a cue, Michael would step somewhere else. Claire, the event manager, was briefed in a quiet, urgent whisper that left her pale but professional. A small staff of trusted employees, including a pair of plainclothes officers, would infiltrate the floor under the guise of serving. The orchestra's final piece would be swapped for a different number, so any timing tied to the original arrangement would fracture. All vendors were ordered to stay backstage until cleared. Before the gala's official start, Michael took a moment to himself in a private anteroom. It was wallpapered in deep tones and smelled faintly of roses. He smoothed his tie and looked at the folded note in his hand. Lena's script of 5 words seemed simple and wholly catastrophic in its implications. He remembered the first time he'd felt truly grateful to a stranger. Years ago, a woman in a subway warned him of a beguiling trap. He ignored her and lost more than money. He vowed, crosswise to himself, not to make that kind of mistake again. He made a deliberate choice. He would go on stage for a brief acknowledgement, a few words about the foundation, but he would do so with an awareness that every eye in the room could contain risk. He would also leave the stage earlier than planned, before the planned final speech, so the crowd's attention would shift unpredictably. The idea was to make himself an inconvenient target. As the doors opened, the first wave of guests arrived. Local dignitaries, donors, and a handful of celebrities whose presence would guarantee flash coverage. They clapped politely at the introductions. Michael moved through the room with the easy charm of someone practiced in small talk, but his reactions were precise and limbed with the obedience of someone following a plan. He watched more than spoke. He tracked faces, noting any that held excess curiosity or a practice of scanning exits rather than the program. At one table, a man in a delivery uniform laughed too loudly at an off-color joke. At another, a lesser-known patron who'd given more than his profile suggested held a napkin like a shield. The orchestra began, and Michael felt the stage managers nod once in his direction. The cue lineup altered as promised. The sound changed a measure later than planned. Gavin's team moved like shadows across the edges of the ballroom, intercepting movement, checking under chairs. No one in the room knew the real choreography except a handful of people who had decided to risk small lies in the service of safety. Halfway through his short acknowledgement, a power flicker stuttered the chandeliers. Gasps and sudden nervous laughter ran like a chill through the crowd. Someone had bumped a main line, a minor electrical hiccup. Gavin's eyes went to the lights, then to the back. It was exactly the kind of noise a plotter would exploit to pull focus. Michael kept his words measured and thanked the guests, stepping down sooner than the schedule allowed. As he crossed the room, he saw Lena at the periphery of the staff cohort. She had been brought forward under the pretense of a formal thanks for her family's years of service. Her small frame was dwarfed by the coat she wore, but her chin was high. Michael gave her a brief nod, the kind a man of his station reserves for the people who matter in quiet ways. Then the first real test. Behind a service door, a flask hissed. Not a sound of triumph, but of something ready to do harm. Server, not on their watch list and wearing a subtle kitchen smock, had moved toward a cut in the ductwork. Gavin's men were on him in seconds, an efficient, unglamorous containment. There were no explosions, no bright spasms of disaster. There was an arrested attempt and the immediate flattening of a threat. The man resisted, but the security team's hold was practiced, clinical. Someone in the crowd whispered arrest, and cameras shifted, but the containment team had made a deliberate choice. Keep the operation quiet. Do not feed rumor. Michael felt the muscles in his face relax in a way that surprised him. They had been taught for hours. Lena's note had given them a line to follow, and for the moment, following it had worked. But as the man was led through a back exit, a second figure slipped, someone who had been close enough to be trusted and distant enough to be unseen. A kitchen electrician, a man who had helped hang lights the week before, vanished through an emergency corridor. Damon swore low and sent 2 agents to intercept. Deception that saved the room's public face also revealed fragility. An organization's trust can be a doorway for those who know how to walk through shadows. Michael moved quickly now, not to grand gestures but to practical, quiet actions. He spoke briefly with the press coordinator and asked them to shift media to human interest coverage. He ensured Rosa and Lena were escorted to a safe room. He felt strangely grateful, not for his own survival, but for the thin, improbable network of people who would risk a small lie to save many lives. Lena had slipped him a note, and in return had asked for a small mercy. Attention. He had given it, and the night had bent, but not broken. For that mercy, however, would not be the final word. The planning men and women who'd set the device were careful and patient. Their pattern remained a threat that required more than reaction. It required tracing the source. Someone in the room, the person who had escaped, was the missing piece. Michael realized with the sober clarity of a man who'd paid many to be invisible. The best way to protect a future was to pursue the truth of how this plan had come together and to do it without flinching. The next hours narrowed into a sequence of interrogations, cross-checks, and small forensic victories. Gavin's team pieced together payroll slips and delivery manifests. A maintenance crew member's phone pinged in a motel outside the city. A vendor's account showed suspicious deposits. Each fact folded carefully into a map that pointed to a small ring of men and technicians who had been contracted, in part to work illicit jobs, tampering with systems, smuggling contraband, masking one thing as another. But conspirators can be messy. They make sloppy mistakes when they believe their plan is invisible. The tall man with the scar had been seen at a diner near a loading dock earlier in the day. A young witness remembered him carrying a case that smelled of solvents. A surveillance camera on a neighboring block caught a van with altered plates. The net tightened in a second. More dangerous truth came to light. Someone on the inside had been promised money and had delivered access. That's how Michael and Gavin found themselves at the theater district loading bay in the pre-dawn hours, peering through a gap in a discarded tarp at the shadow of a crate that looked, in the gray morning light, like an ordinary shipping mistake. Their team moved with the practiced hush of men who had been trained to see things ordinary eyes did not. They opened crates, examined cylinders, traced valves to small dispersal rigs designed to tie into airflow systems. The devices were crude but effective within a confined space. They could have made people ill enough to create mass panic. They could have killed if a volatile compound had been used. Gavin's radio compressed with orders. Arrest teams closed off exits, and police converged on the motel where 2 primary suspects were staying. The tall man with the scar was cornered on a stairwell. When he saw the uniforms, there was a moment's flicker of a grin, like a man who'd expected a different ending. "You got Lena's note, didn't you?" he said, not a question so much as a spiteful recognition. kid did good work. Michael had expected anger. What he hadn't expected was the look of almost resigned respect. In the brief exchange that followed, the group learned a harsh, functional truth. The ring was not random criminals, but people contracted by an entity who wanted to humiliate and financially damage the beneficiaries of Michael's philanthropy. There had been an argument 2 months earlier. One of Michael's foundation projects had threatened to expose procurement fraud at a municipal level. Someone had decided retribution should be loud, public, and humiliating. When the tall man with the scar was led away, he spat into the gutter. You think you're above it, he sneered. You think giving money makes you better. But you make enemies. You make people hungry. Michael looked at him for the first time without the buffer of wealth. The man's teeth were not clean. There was a way that anger could harden a person. Michael did not say what he might have once. Any number of cavalier retorts learned in boardrooms. He felt only a slow, cold obligation to be better in practice than the man's accusation. Back at the hotel, Lena's presence in the secure room had become a quiet spectacle. She sat with a hot chocolate cup between 2 small hands, the room's carpet swallowing her feet. Rosa hovered nearby, grateful and guarded. When Michael came to speak with them, he did not stand like a man who had saved anything. He stood like someone who had been given an opportunity to correct a hierarchy. He knelt to Lena's height. You were brave, he said simply. You did something important. Lena looked at him with a child's honesty. I just wanted them to be safe. You did more than that, he answered. You reminded us to listen. Rosa's eyes filled, and in that moment, something broke open between gratitude and repair. Michael reached into his pocket and unfolded the small paper Lena had given him. He smoothed it, the 5 words like a talisman. You and your mother are safe, he said. And I want to make sure you're always safe. He meant it. The men in custody were charged. Were charged. Evidence tied them to a contractor implicated in illegal activity. The foundation issued a quiet statement about security improvements. No press of self-congratulation. In private, Michael authorized relocation assistance for Rosa's family, anonymity protections, and a small scholarship fund in Lena's name to go to children of domestic staff, a gesture that would be practical rather than performative. The room that night was quiet in a different way than earlier. The scarred man's echo, you think you're above it, hung for a moment, then thinned. Michael sat at a corner table and watched the quartet play the last quiet numbers for a handful of guests who had chosen to stay. He felt the odd compulsion to be small and plain and useful in a way no donation could ever capture. Lena's face had not been photographed by the press. She had not been thrust into sudden fame. She had instead been recognized privately, her courage acknowledged by changes that would keep her safe. That anonymity felt like a small, precise justice. When the night drew finally to its close, Michael walked Rosa and Lena to a door where a car waited. He handed Rosa an envelope with instructions and numbers. Lena tucked her stuffed rabbit back into her bag, not yet comprehending the swell of attention that had gone along with her simple act of warning. Michael offered a last sentence, a human confession wrapped in the language of change. Because of you, we did better. Days passed in the wake of the gala like a city waking from a dream. The story arc in the public eye was small and tidy. A few arrests, a brief statement in security upgrades announced to donors. But the real work occurred off the record. Legal teams tracing contracts, fund managers changing vendor procedures, and private conversations about how someone within a system had been allowed to act. For Rosa, the aftermath was both relief and the very practical difficulty of shifting from fear to normalcy. She continued to work, but Michael's office had arranged for encrypted phone numbers, private transportation for the family, and a plan to put them into temporary housing in a safe neighborhood until the case closed. Most strikingly, Michael insisted the foundation create a modest, sustained program for the children of the staff who kept his household functioning. Tutoring, summer camps, and an educational fund that would cover school supplies and extracurriculars. He wanted the family's safety to translate into opportunity for Lena. Lena processed these gifts with a child's slow, careful appraisal. When Michael visited them a week later, not with press or speeches, but with books and a small stack of simple toys, she greeted him like a person who had handed someone a secret and wanted to see what they would do with it. "A thank you," she said, surprising both of them with the dryness of the gratitude. It was not a grand performative line. It was a small, precise truth. "You don't have to say it," Michael replied. "Just keep being who you are." Rosa watched them with an expression that held both pride and a kind of new suspicion, counsel born of a world that had shown her kindness and danger in the same breath. "If you ever need anything," she said to Michael. "We only want our lives to be calm," Michael nodded. "That's fair, and if you ever need the foundation for school or training, it's there." News cycles moved on. The guilty were tried. Sentences were meted out. The link to the procurement scandal that had implicated a municipal contractor was slowly exposed in investigative reporting, and a handful of officials resigned. Those were public victories, the kind executives speak of when discussing policy. But the private shifts mattered more to Michael. He found himself thinking often of Lena, of the guileless certainty in a child who knew when to speak. Months later, at a smaller, informal event funded by the foundation, Michael took a moment on a modest stage to speak about listening. He talked without flourish, mentioning security only to say that precautions were not enough. Attention had to be paid to the human margins. He announced a pilot program for staff children, naming it not for tax breaks or headlines, but for Lena herself. The Lena Initiative. He asked Lena's family to come forward quietly. They stood, embarrassed and proud, while applause traveled in polite ripples across the small audience. After the event, Michael walked with Lena to the courtyard where a single street lamp painted their faces gold. "You changed more than a night," he said. "You made us accountable." Lena looked at him, then at the stars that could only just be seen through the city glow. "Will you still give money to places that need it?" she asked, as though testing whether he would remain the man she'd helped. "Yes," he said. "But I'll do it better. I'll try to be the kind of person who listens first." Lena nodded sagely, as children do when they sense an adult making a promise. "Good," she said simply, "because it's scary if people don't listen." Michael smiled, and in a way that surprised him, meant it. This small, brave girl had given him a more valuable gift than safety. She had shown him how fragile the space between the powerful and the overlooked could be, and how easy it was to bridge it if one only chose to. The city kept moving. Gowns were stored away, contracts amended, security badges reissued. But for Michael Thompson and for Rosa and Lena, the night's small note had rearranged priorities. It had carved out a place where humility could fit. And it had left them all with the quiet knowledge that sometimes the bravest, sharpest voices come small and unexpected, and that listening to them can save more than a life.